The silence in the nursery was shattered by a scream that tore through the air like a siren. "No, no, no." Abigail Carter's voice broke as she stumbled through the door, her eyes locking onto the horrific scene before her. Little Sophie, barely 16 months old, lay crumpled on the hardwood floor, a trickle of blood pooling beneath her tiny head. The crib's rail stood firm, locked in place, but somehow the toddler had climbed out and fallen. Abigail's knees buckled as she dropped beside the child, her trembling hands hovering over Sophie's still form. "Please, baby, please," she whispered, fumbling for her phone with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. 911, it's an emergency. A baby, she's not moving. There's blood. Hurry. Tears blurred her vision as she cradled Sophie gently, her voice a desperate chant. "You're okay, sweetheart. Help's coming." But the air held more than fear. A sharp, acrid smell stung her nose, heroin. Abigail's gaze snapped to the bed across the room, where Sophie's mother, Cassandra Vale, lay sprawled, her body limp, a needle glinting on the nightstand. Her chest rose faintly, but her eyes were closed, her lips parted in a lifeless stupor. Abigail's heart pounded with a mix of panic and rage. She'd only been working at the Vale estate for 6 weeks, hired as a housekeeper to keep the sprawling mansion in order. But this wasn't the first time she'd found Cassandra like this. 3 times before she'd stumbled across the woman in a drug-induced haze, but never with Sophie hurt. Never with blood on the floor. Abigail had taken the job to save for her nursing degree, not to play savior in a house rotting from the inside. As sirens wailed closer, she pressed the towel she'd grabbed against Sophie's head, whispering, "Hold on, little one. I've got you." The front door slammed open and the hallway erupted into chaos. Paramedics stormed in, their boots pounding against the polished oak. A woman in a navy uniform knelt beside Abigail, gently taking Sophie into her arms. "Head trauma, pulse weak but steady," she muttered, her hands moving with practiced precision. Another paramedic bolted upstairs to Cassandra, a Narcan kit in hand. Abigail stood frozen, her apron soaked with Sophie's blood, her mind racing. She was just a housekeeper. Nothing in her job description had prepared her for this. A sharp voice cut through the chaos. "What the hell happened here?" It was Meredith, the estate's manager, Cassandra's right hand, her designer heels clicking like warning shots as she descended the staircase. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. Abigail, blood-streaked and trembling, the paramedics rushing Sophie to the ambulance. "Where's Cassandra? Where's the baby?" Meredith demanded. Abigail's voice was raw. "Cassandra overdosed. Sophie's on her way to the hospital." She fell, hit her head. Meredith's face didn't soften. It hardened, her lips curling into a calculating frown. "Does Mr. Vale know?" she hissed. Abigail blinked, thrown by the question. "He's in London. I didn't call him. I called 911. Meredith's eyes flashed with something close to panic. "You shouldn't have involved the police. Daniel Vale doesn't like his family's business aired out like this." Abigail's jaw tightened. "A baby was bleeding. I wasn't going to wait for permission." The hospital waiting room was a sterile limbo, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Abigail sat hunched in a plastic chair, her blood-stained apron still on, her hands clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman she barely recognized, hair tangled, eyes hollow, collar stained red. Sophie was in the pediatric trauma unit, stable but under observation for a concussion and a possible skull fracture. Abigail had signed the intake forms because Cassandra was still unconscious when they arrived. Across the room Meredith paced, her phone pressed to her ear, muttering about containing the situation. She stopped long enough to glare at Abigail. "You've made this worse," she snapped. "Daniel Vale has people for this. He doesn't need the press sniffing around." Abigail stood, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Sophie was bleeding out while her mother was passed out with a needle in her arm. "You think he'd rather I let her die to keep it quiet?" Meredith's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. For once she had no comeback. Abigail's phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She answered hesitantly. "This is Daniel Vale," a deep voice said, clipped and urgent. "I just landed. What's happened to my daughter?" Abigail's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "Mr. Vale." Sophie fell and hit her head. "She's in the hospital, stable now, but it was bad. Cassandra, she overdosed. I found her unconscious. I called 911. There was a long pause, heavy with unspoken weight. "Stay there," he said finally. "I'm coming." The line went dead. Abigail sank back into the chair, her mind replaying the moment she'd found Sophie, the blood, the needle, the silence that screamed louder than anything else. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was a witness, a protector, and maybe the only one who'd cared enough to act. Daniel Vale's sleek black SUV screeched to a stop outside St. Catherine's Medical Center. He stepped out, his tailored suit barely wrinkled despite the transatlantic flight, but his face betrayed him, eyes wild, jaw tight, a man unraveling. He stormed through the ER doors, his presence commanding the room. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the hum of the hospital. A nurse pointed him to the pediatric ICU, where Abigail stood outside the glass-walled room, watching Sophie sleep under the soft glow of monitors. A small bandage covered her forehead, her tiny chest rising and falling. Daniel's gaze locked onto his daughter, and for a moment, his composure cracked, his broad shoulders sagging. "You're the housekeeper," he said, not a question. Abigail nodded. "Abigail Carter." He glanced at her, then back at Sophie. "They said she fell. That she was bleeding. And her mother?" His voice broke. Abigail spoke softly. "I found Sophie on the floor, blood everywhere. Cassandra was unconscious, heroin on the nightstand. I didn't think, I just called for help." Daniel's eyes met hers, searching as if trying to see the truth in her words. "Why you?" he asked, almost to himself. "Because no one else was there," Abigail replied. A nurse approached, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Vale, Sophie's stable. The injury was serious, but we got to her in time." Another hour, though. She didn't finish, but the weight of her words hung between them. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "Thank you," he said to Abigail, the words raw like they cost him something to say. Before she could respond, he turned to the nurse. "And my wife?" The nurse's expression tightened. "She's awake. In recovery. There's an officer with her now." Daniel's face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Cassandra Vale woke in a hospital bed, and dripping into her arm, her once perfect makeup smudged into dark circles. A police officer stood by the door, his expression unreadable. She groaned, her voice hoarse. What happened?" Daniel entered, flanked by a nurse and a social worker. His presence filled the room, but his voice was ice. "You overdosed, Cassandra. Again." Sophie fell, hit her head. There was blood everywhere. She could have died. Cassandra's eyes widened, her hands clutching the thin hospital blanket. I don't remember," she stammered. Daniel cut her off, his voice low but lethal. "You left our daughter alone while you got high. She was bleeding, and you didn't even hear her cry." The social worker stepped forward, her tone professional but firm. "Mr. Vale, we've notified Child Protective Services. A case has been opened and custody arrangements will be reviewed." Cassandra's voice rose, shrill and desperate. "You can't take her from me." Daniel's eyes didn't soften. "You did that yourself the moment you chose drugs over her safety." Abigail watched from the hallway, her heart heavy. She hadn't meant to become the center of this storm, but she couldn't unsee what she'd seen. Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I need you to stay with Sophie," he said, "until I sort this out. You're the only one I trust in that house right now." Abigail nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't signed up for this, but Sophie's tiny hand in hers had changed everything. 3 days later, the Vale estate was quieter than it had ever been. Cassandra had been discharged but barred from returning home pending the CPS investigation. Sophie was back, her bandage smaller, her giggles returning, but the bruises on her forehead lingered like a silent accusation. Daniel spent every night by her side, his laptop forgotten, his phone unanswered. Abigail stayed too, bringing Sophie's favorite stuffed elephant and singing soft lullabies when the toddler stirred. In the kitchen one morning, Daniel poured coffee into a chipped mug, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Abigail entered, carrying Sophie's blanket, hesitant at the doorway. "You can come in," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She stepped inside, setting the blanket on the counter. "I checked the security footage," Daniel said, his tone measured. "You didn't hesitate. You ran to her the second you heard her cry." Abigail nodded. "I couldn't ignore it. Something in me just moved." Daniel leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "I didn't see it," he admitted. "Cassandra's been spiraling for months, and I told myself it was stress that she'd pull through. I was wrong." Abigail hesitated, then spoke. "You wanted to believe in her. That's not a crime." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "You saw what I didn't?" "How?" Abigail's voice was quiet but steady. "I saw someone who'd given up. Someone who didn't even hear her own daughter's cries. The tension in the house wasn't just between Daniel and Cassandra. Meredith lingered like a shadow, her presence sharp and unwelcome. She cornered Abigail in the nursery one afternoon, her arms crossed, her voice low. "You're getting too comfortable," she said, her eyes glinting. "Talking to Daniel like you're his confidant. You're a housekeeper, not family." Abigail didn't flinch. "I'm doing what needs to be done." Meredith stepped closer. "You're doing what gets you noticed. Don't think I don't see it." Daniel's voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem?" He stood in the doorway, his expression hard. Meredith straightened, her smile forced. "Just reminding Abigail of her place, sir?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Her place is protecting my daughter. Something you failed to do." Meredith's face paled, but she didn't argue. "Take a leave of absence," Daniel said. "I need people I can trust right now." Meredith left without a word, her heels echoing down the hall. That evening, Sophie returned home, her tiny arms reaching for Abigail the moment she saw her. Daniel watched, his expression softening. "She trusts you," he said quietly. "More than she trusts me right now." Abigail smiled, brushing a curl from Sophie's face. "She just needs to feel safe." They stood in the nursery, the soft hum of a lullaby mobile filling the silence. Daniel's voice was almost a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Abigail looked at him, her eyes steady. "Because I know what it's like to be invisible. I grew up in foster care, bounced around, forgotten. When I heard Sophie cry, I couldn't walk away." Daniel nodded, something shifting in his gaze. That night, Abigail found a note on her bed. "Stay as long as you want. The room next to Sophie's is yours. Daniel." Weeks later, Cassandra returned, her appearance polished but her eyes hollow. She stepped out of a car at the estate's gates, her voice sharp. "I'm her mother. I deserve to see her." Daniel met her on the steps, his posture unyielding. "Not until CPS clears you." Sophie, in Abigail's arms, whimpered at her mother's voice. Cassandra's face twisted. "You're turning her against me. You and that maid." Abigail's voice was calm but firm. "She remembers Cassandra. She remembers being alone." Daniel stepped forward. "I'm filing for full custody. I have the footage, the hospital reports, Abigail's testimony. This ends now." Cassandra's bravado crumbled, her voice breaking. "You can't take her from me." Daniel's eyes were cold. "You already lost her." The courtroom was quiet as the judge delivered the ruling. Sole custody to Daniel Vale. Supervised visitation for Cassandra Vale. Outside, reporters swarmed, but Daniel ignored them, one hand holding Sophie's, the other resting on Abigail's shoulder as they walked to the car. The Vale estate felt different now, warmer, lighter. Abigail moved into the West Wing, no longer a housekeeper but a guardian, a confidant. One spring evening, under the blooming magnolia tree, Daniel knelt beside Abigail as Sophie slept in her lap. He held a small velvet box, his voice steady. "You saved my daughter. You saved me. Let me spend my life proving I'm worthy of that." Abigail's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from being seen. This story moved you, share it. Honor the women who step up when no one else does. Subscribe if you believe in second chances, in love that shows up unasked. Be the reason someone still believes in hope.